My name is Jason Ortiz, and this is the story of how my HOA tried to fine my 78-year-old grandmother $500 for the wheelchair ramp that let her leave her own house. I want to tell you up front, I filmed almost every conversation in this story, and that decision ended up mattering more than I could have imagined. If you're new here, welcome. If you've seen my other videos, you know these stories usually end with an HOA board regretting their decisions. This one is personal, because it's not about me, it's about my grandmother, Rosa, who raised me after my parents passed when I was 12. She's the reason I turned out okay, and watching what happened to her over the last 6 months made me angrier than anything else I've covered on this channel. Let me start from the beginning. My grandmother had a stroke 18 months ago. She recovered most of her speech and a lot of her mobility, but her left side never fully came back, and long-term she needs a wheelchair for anything beyond a few steps. She still lives independently in the same house she's owned for over 30 years, in a community called Fernwood Gardens, with home health aides checking in twice a day. Before the stroke, her front entrance had 3 concrete steps up to the door. After she came home from rehab, those 3 steps became the biggest obstacle in her life. She literally could not leave her own house without help lifting her wheelchair down them. So the family pooled money and had a proper ADA-compliant wooden ramp built along the side of the porch, sturdy, code-compliant, with handrails, built by a licensed contractor who specializes in accessibility modifications. It took about a week to build. My grandmother cried the first time she rolled down it by herself to get her mail. That's the image you should keep in your head for what's about to happen. 9 days after the ramp was finished, a violation notice showed up in her mailbox. Unauthorized exterior modification, ramp structure not submitted for Architectural Review Committee approval per Article 9. Fine, $500. Structure must be brought into compliance or removed within 30 days. My grandmother called me in tears. Not because of the money, she could afford $500, but because the letter felt like a threat to take away the one thing that had given her independence back. I drove over immediately. I read the letter 3 times, and something about it bothered me beyond the obvious cruelty. An HOA fining someone for a medical accessibility modification felt like it had to be illegal, not just unkind. So before reacting emotionally, I decided to actually learn the law. It didn't take long to find what I needed. The Fair Housing Act, at the federal level, requires HOAs to make reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities, including allowing modifications like ramps, and associations generally cannot require the same aesthetic review process for accessibility structures that they'd apply to, say, a new fence color. Many states also have their own accessibility statutes that go even further, sometimes explicitly stating that HOAs cannot fine or block ADA-compliant ramps for a resident with a documented disability. I printed everything, the federal guidance, the relevant state statute, and a letter from my grandmother's doctor confirming her mobility diagnosis, and I called the HOA office to schedule a meeting, because I wanted to handle this calmly and on the record before it became something bigger. The woman I spoke with, Carol Jennings, was the HOA's Architectural Review Committee chair. I explained the situation calmly, my grandmother's stroke, the medical necessity of the ramp, the doctor's letter, the Fair Housing Act accommodation requirement. Carol's response was polite but dismissive. I understand it's a difficult situation, she said, but every exterior modification, regardless of purpose, has to go through architectural review. That's the same standard for everyone. We can't make exceptions just because we feel bad. This isn't a request for an exception, I said. Federal disability law requires reasonable accommodation. Denying or fining a compliant accessibility ramp isn't a discretionary aesthetic decision, it may not be legal for the HOA to treat it that way. I'll pass that along to the board, she said, in a tone that told me she had no intention of doing so seriously. That's when I decided to start recording every future interaction. Not to trap anyone, just because I had a feeling this wasn't going to be resolved with a polite phone call, and I wanted an honest record of exactly what was said, in case it mattered later. 2 weeks passed. No response from the board. Then a second notice arrived, this one increasing the fine to $750 and adding a new line, continued non-compliance may result in placement of a lien against the property. A lien against a 78-year-old widow's paid-off house, over a wheelchair ramp. I remember standing in her kitchen reading that line out loud and just feeling this cold, focused anger replaced the frustration I'd had before. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a board choosing, repeatedly, to escalate against a disabled resident instead of just checking the law I'd already handed them. I requested a formal board meeting, and this time I brought my phone, openly clearly at the start that I was recording for my own records. Nobody objected. I laid out everything again, the doctor's letter, the Fair Housing Act language, the state accessibility statute, directly to the full board this time, not just Carol. The board president, a man named Wallace Griggs, listened with his arms crossed the entire time. When I finished, he said, "Mr. Ortiz, we sympathize with your grandmother's situation, but this board has a responsibility to maintain architectural consistency for every homeowner. If we make an exception here, we'll be fielding modification requests from everyone claiming a medical need." "This isn't a claim," I said, sliding the doctor's letter across the table. "It's documented. And under federal law, this isn't optional for the HOA to accommodate, it's a legal requirement, not a courtesy." Wallace didn't even look at the letter. "The fine stands, and the 30-day compliance window remains in effect. If the structure isn't approved or removed, we'll proceed with next steps." I sat there for a second, genuinely stunned that a board would say that on the record, with everything I just handed them sitting on the table. That I left that meeting and called a disability rights attorney the same night, a woman named Farah Whitcomb, who specialized in Fair Housing Act cases specifically involving HOA disputes. I sent her the recording, the doctor's letter, both violation notices, and a timeline of every interaction. She called me back 2 days later, and I could hear it in her voice immediately. This wasn't a gray area to her. "Jason, what you've described is about as clear a Fair Housing Act violation as I've seen. The board was formally notified of a documented disability and a request for reasonable accommodation, and they not only refused, they escalated fines and threatened a lien. That recording where the board president dismisses the doctor's letter on the record, that's extraordinarily damaging to their position." Farah sent the formal demand letter the following week. For about 10 days, there was silence, which in hindsight I understand now was probably the board scrambling to find their own legal advice, though we found out later they didn't actually consult a real estate attorney until after HUD contacted them directly. That's the part that changed everything. Farah's HUD complaint triggered an actual federal inquiry, and once Fernwood Gardens, HOA received an official letter from a housing and urban development investigator requesting documentation of the board's decision-making process, the tone shifted overnight. Carol called me directly this time, her voice noticeably different, nervous instead of dismissive. "Jason, we'd like to resolve this outside of any formal proceedings. The board is prepared to waive all fines and formally approve the ramp under our accommodation policy." "What accommodation policy?" I asked, because as far as I knew, one hadn't existed until that phone call. There was a pause. "We're implementing one, going forward." I told her I'd have my attorney review any written resolution before agreeing to anything, because at that point I didn't trust a verbal promise from the same board that had threatened my grandmother with a lien 3 weeks earlier. Farah negotiated the final terms over the next month. The settlement included full reversal of both fines, formal written approval of the ramp with no further review required, a written accommodation policy for the HOA going forward, actually reviewed by Farah before it was finalized, since the board's first draft was still vague enough to cause problems for the next disabled resident, and, because of the documented bad faith and the lien threat against a senior citizen, a payment covering all of my grandmother's legal fees plus an additional damages amount that Farah felt was fair given the distress the board had caused. My grandmother still doesn't fully understand everything that happened behind the scenes. She just knows the letters stopped coming and the ramp is officially, permanently hers to keep. When I told her it was resolved, she just squeezed my hand and said, "I knew you'd figure it out, Mijo." That's the moment that made every frustrating phone call worth it. The new accommodation policy is now posted publicly at the Fernwood Gardens clubhouse. I've heard from 2 other residents in the community since then, One with a hearing-impaired spouse who'd been quietly denied a modified doorbell system years earlier, and another who'd been afraid to even ask about a stairlift because of how the board had treated my grandmother's case. Both are now going through the new, actually functional accommodation process. Wallace Griggs did not run for re-election when his board term ended a few months later. I don't know if that was pressure from the community or his own choice, and honestly, I don't care which it was. Looking back, the thing I keep thinking about is how differently this could have gone if I hadn't started recording those conversations, or if I hadn't taken that first violation notice seriously enough to actually research the law instead of just being upset. A lot of families in this situation, especially with an elderly relative who doesn't want to cause trouble, just quietly comply, remove the ramp, pay the fine, lose the independence that ramp represented. If there's one thing I want you to take from my grandmother's story, it's this: disability accommodation isn't a favor an HOA grants you. It's a federal legal requirement, and if a board treats a doctor's letter like it's optional, that's not a gray area, that's a violation, and there are real consequences available when it happens. That's my grandmother's story. If you've ever watched someone you love get pushed around by a board that should have known better, I want to hear about it in the comments. And if this one hit you the way it hit me while living through it, subscribe. We've got more stories like this coming every week. Thank you for watching, and thank you for caring about my grandmother's story. I'll see you in the next one.